Welcome to Jake's Place. Today's project is to build this taper cutting jig for the table saw. I've got with me a table leg that I made out of laminated ash, and here is a scrap piece of MDF. I'm going to use this MDF to make a taper jig to hold this leg so I can taper the ends of the legs. First, getting the leg set up at the taper that you want is completely dependent upon the table that you're making, the length of the legs, the size of the legs. So any of this could be made in any different number of angles, and I'm going to set mine up for the angle that I'm making a couple of small end tables. Well, the next step to building up my tapering jig is to use these. I've got some vertical toggle clamps. They were about $6 a piece, and I'm going to mount those to the sliding bed right over here. But here's the thing, if you look at the base and where the clamp meets the material, yeah, you only have about 1/4 of an inch, not much. So what I got to do is build these up on a couple of riser blocks to match the thickness of my table legs. So I've got one of my table legs right here, and we're going to measure that and see 1 3/4. So 1 3/4 is the mark that we need to clamp down on that. Maybe a slight bit less so we get some good clamping pressure. Well, as it turns out, I got pretty lucky. If the legs are 1 3/4 thick, and I've got about a 1/4 inch gap for that toggle clamp, you subtract the 1/4 inch and it's 1 1/2. My spacer blocks need to be 1 1/2. I happen to have some scraps laying around, and this is a 2x3 that is just not quite 1 1/2. It's about a 1/16 undersize. That'll give us just a little bit of clamping pressure. I think this is going to work out pretty good. So I've got this piece of MDF. MDF's great stuff. It's cheap, it's stable, and I'm not too worried about how many uses I get out of this because it's not going to cost me a terrible lot if I scrap this. But there is one thing, you got to treat MDF right. You can't get it wet, and you always want to drill pilot holes. So I've marked off the face of this, the feed direction, and where I'm going to put blocks on here for my toggle clamps. So I'm going to drill pilot holes to make sure I don't crumble the MDF and make it fall apart. So let's do that right now. Helps if you can find a sharp drill bit too. I'm going to go to the bottom and use this countersinking bit. I want to sink the screw heads up so that when you slide this thing across the bed of the table saw, that the screw heads are up into the material so that it won't scrape the bottom of the table saw. I also don't want the screws to split my soft pine riser blocks. So I'm going to drill through my taper jig into these blocks and put pilot holes in these so that these also won't split when the screws go in. Let's get a toggle clamp up there, get it marked so we can drill pilot holes to mount this. There we go. Oh yeah, there we go. Let's cut some tapers. Well, there we go. We've got a taper sled. But there's always something new to learn every time you do something. So let's take a look at this and review a couple of points that I learned making this taper jig for the first time. One of the things that I learned, I was getting in too big of a hurry. I started driving the screws in, and as you can see, I split that piece of wood because I was driving the screws too fast and too hard. Another thing, you can see the ridge on my table leg right here. My table saw, the blade won't go up high enough to cut over that once it's up on top of this surface. So either I will have to plane that down by hand to match the other taper, or I will have to modify or create a different type of tapering jig. Here's another thing that I learned in the middle of the process. This toggle clamp was too close to the taper end of the leg and should have been placed further up here, where you can get a good clamp on the flat portion of the leg ahead of the taper, because back here, after one side gets cut, then you're clamping down on a tapered surface. And even worse, once that tapered surface goes down to the bottom, you're clamping it and it'll make your piece of wood want to flex or tip up. That's all for today. Thanks for joining me here at Jake's Place. I'm Jake. Have a great one.